The following is from a book review and analysis video I made on Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. The book is an autobiographical account of Frederick Douglass's upbringing in slavery and his escape from slavery. This clip covers some of the many passages within that are full of valuable historical and philosophical information. Please enjoy, and may your conversations related to racism and the history of slavery be made better by watching. And this first section is called Loving Severe Gore. So this first passage involves one of the very first encounters Frederick Douglass had with the true brutality, the true brutal nature of slavery. Whenever he was very, very young, he was a slave, but he was a little kid, so he didn't actually get to see whippings and all that sort of thing because he wasn't capable of being whipped. You don't whip a 3-year-old. But this encounter that he has involves the master at the plantation he was at whipping an aunt of his right in front of him. And the chapter goes into more detail than what I'm going to read here, but what I'm going to read here is sufficiently horrifying to horrify you as it horrified Frederick Douglass, at least in the conceptual nature, I guess. I don't know what that sentence was, but I think you get the point. This passage, I read it and I was like, whoa. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heartrending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I shall never forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. As you can see there, Frederick Douglass was an incredible writer. And in that passage, as I was alluding to before I read it, it hits you with the horror of what he was about. It says the blood-stained gate of the hell of slavery. It's like that, it hits you. It really, like Frederick Douglass, it's like the whole book, he's shaking you. And he's trying to get the people who read it to understand that what is happening in the institution of slavery is pure devilry. It's pure satanic shit going on. And he gets that message across so well. It's so terrifying. And that passage, as the whole book does, it just grips you and it shakes you and it just tells you, wake up. This is evil. Pay attention to it. Now this next passage has to do with an overseer that Frederick had to deal with whenever he was very young. And as you will see, this overseer had a very fitting name. And Frederick, in this particular passage, he was talking about just basically the life, the day-to-day life of a slave. Talking about being woken up by the driver's horn in the morning. So just keep that in mind, and we will read the passage now. At the sound of this, all must rise and be off to the field. There must be no halting. Everyone must be at his or her post, and woe betides them who hear not this morning summons to the field. For if they are not awakened by the sense of hearing, they are by the sense of feeling. No age nor sex finds any favor. Mr. Severe, the overseer, used to stand by the door of the quarter, armed with a large hickory stick and heavy cowskin, ready to whip anyone who was so unfortunate as not to hear, or from any other cause was prevented from being ready to start for the field at the sound of the horn. Mr. Severe was rightly named. He was a cruel man. I have seen him whip a woman, causing the blood to run half an hour at the time, and this, too, in the midst of her crying children, pleading for their mother's release. He seemed to take pleasure in manifesting his fiendish barbarity. Added to his cruelty, he was a profane swearer. It was enough to chill the blood and stiffen the hair of an ordinary man to hear him talk. Scarce a sentence escaped him, but that was commenced or concluded by some horrid oath. The field was the place to witness his cruelty and profanity. His presence made it both the field of blood and of blasphemy. From the rising till the going down of the sun, he was cursing, raving, cutting, and slashing among the slaves of the field in the most frightful manner. His career was short. He died very soon after I went to Colonel Lloyd's, and he died as he lived, uttering with his dying groans bitter curses and horrid oaths. His death was regarded by the slaves as the result of a merciful providence. Again, we see here just how literate Frederick Douglass was. I mean, that was such a well-written, description of evil embodied in a man, known as Mr. Severe. I mean, what a name. If you ever hear anyone watering down what slavery was, just read them that. This is something that should never be overlooked, this part of our history. It shouldn't be the thing that defines American history, as some people would like to make it out to be. But it should absolutely be something that every American, young, old, and everything in between, every American should be exposed to the reality, the harsh, evil reality of what slavery was. And as I've been saying, I think this is this is a good book to get that message across of the fact that this really was a genocide, both, literally, and physically, but also morally. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will go from Mr. Severe to talking about Mr. Gore, who was another overseer that Frederick had to deal with. This is a even more horrifying account of the evil of slavery, and you could also say that Mr. Gore had perhaps even a more fitting name than Mr. Severe. Mr. Gore was a grave man, and, though a young man, he indulged in no jokes, said no funny words, seldom smiled. His words were in perfect keeping with his looks, and his looks were in perfect keeping with his words. Overseers will sometimes indulge in a witty word, even with the slaves. Not so with Mr. Gore. He spoke but to command, and commanded but to be obeyed. He dealt sparingly with his words, and bountifully with his whip, never using the former where the latter would answer as well. When he whipped, he seemed to do so from a sense of duty, and feared no consequences. He did nothing reluctantly, no matter how disagreeable, always at his post, never inconsistent. He never promised but to fulfill. He was, in a word, a man of the most inflexible firmness and stone-like coolness. His savage barbarity was equaled only by the consummate coolness with which he commanded the grossest and most savage deeds upon the slaves under his charge. Mr. Gore once undertook to whip one of Colonel Lloyd's slaves by the name of Demby. He had given Demby but few stripes when, to get rid of the scourging, he ran and plunged himself into a creek and stood there at the depth of his shoulders, refusing to come out. Mr. Gore told him that he would give him 3 calls, and that if he did not come out, at the 3rd call he would shoot him. The 1st call was given. Demby made no response, but stood his ground. The 2nd and 3rd calls were given with the same result. Mr. Gore then, without consultation or deliberation with anyone, not even giving Demby an additional call, raised his musket to his face, taking deadly aim at his standing victim, and in an instant poor Demby was no more. His mangled body sank out of sight, and blood and brains marked the water where he had stood. I don't think I need to say anything about that. I think the passage speaks for itself. Black people were viewed as not worthless to slave owners and overseers, as they were obviously worth using for work, but they were seen as dispensable. And I think this is very well illustrated by this next passage, where Frederick Douglass cites what was often said about slaves. and about black people by white people, specifically the white people that Frederick Douglass had encountered at that time in his life. It was a common saying, even among little white boys, that it was worth half a cent to kill a nigger and half a cent to bury one. Now this next passage will illuminate to you why I described this first section of the video as loving severe gore. You know, you may understand the references to severe gore, but what is the loving part? Well, you're about to find out. This next passage, though, you must know something going in. Immediately before this passage, Frederick had described how a slave who had been on a massive plantation, who had never actually met the master of the plantation, had been out walking by himself when a white man on a horse, rode up to him and asked him, where his master was, and the slave answered, and then the white man on the horse said, well, do you like your master? And the slave said, no, he's horrible, blah, blah, blah. And the white man rode on, and as it turns out, that white man was the master of that slave plantation, and severely punished the slave, who was totally ignorant of the fact that he was talking to the man that actually owned him. So just know that that story of deception immediately preceded the passage that I'm going to read now. It is partly in consequence of such facts that slaves, when inquired of as to their condition and the character of their masters, almost universally say they are contented, and that their masters are kind. The slaveholders have been known to send in spies among their slaves, to ascertain their views and feelings in regard to their condition. The frequency of this has had the effect to establish among the slaves the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. They suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it, and in doing so prove themselves a part of the human family. If they have anything to say of their masters, it is generally in their master's favor, especially when speaking to an untried man. I have been frequently asked, when a slave, if I had a kind master, and do not remember ever to have given a negative answer, nor did I, in pursuing this course, consider myself as uttering what was absolutely false. For I always measured the kindness of my master by the standard of kindness set up among slaveholders around us. Moreover, slaves are like other people, and imbibe prejudices quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves, and this too, in some cases, when the very reverse is true. Indeed, it is not uncommon for slaves even to fall out and quarrel among themselves about the relative goodness of their masters, each contending for the superior goodness of his own over that of the others. At the very same time, they mutually execrate their masters when viewed separately. It was so on our plantation. When Colonel Lloyd's slaves met the slaves of Jacob Jepson, they seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters. Colonel Lloyd's slaves contending that he was the richest, and Mr. Jepson's slaves that he was the smartest and most of a man. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would boast his ability to buy and sell Jacob Jepson. Mr. Jepson's slaves would boast his ability to whip Colonel Lloyd. These quarrels would almost always end in a fight between the parties, and those that whipped were supposed to have gained the point at issue. They seemed to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed a disgrace indeed. And so you see there, like I said, loving severe gore is the title of this section, in that there was, like, due to fear and just the oppression of, the master's gaze, the slaves would say that they liked their masters. They would defend their masters even against other slaves that criticized their masters. That passage, it really illustrates just how sad the situation was. Now, I think it's important to point out here before I move on to the next section in this video that Frederick Douglass was not a all white people are devils type person, as some people are today, some civil rights activists are today. He was not a retributive racist, as some even black intellectuals are today. He hated racialism. He thought, he was very much a, at least from this book And from what was written in the introduction and you know, the close of this book, it seems very very much like Frederick Douglass wanted a colorblind society where people were judged based on the content of their character and not on the color of their skin. I just bring that up because lots of people will try and use civil rights activists of the past to justify basically, you know, a new form of racism with a new air of respectability in our current day and age that is the kind of anti-racist movement, even though a lot of what they say is pretty racist. And I just point that out because Frederick Douglass was not a fan of this, you know, re-racialization type stuff that we're seeing today. He would not be a fan of it. In fact, Frederick Douglass, after his first wife died, married a white woman. The institution of slavery, as he did not designate it as a singularly white problem. Frederick Douglass would talk at certain various points in this book about how just slavery as a thing was degrading both to the slave and to the master. I'm going to get into a little bit of that later, but it was slavery that he saw as the true evil enemy, not the skin color of his master.